Well, today's April Fool's Day, big day, right? And so, my name is Michael. I really appreciate the acknowledgement and the praise that I got from both my co-chairs and my committee. It's been an honor just to be here for the last 4 years, at least in this department. And I wanted to start off this presentation by first ask you to take some seeds off of this corn right here. This corn is rare because you can put it down 2 feet deep and it'll still come up. You know. So what you're holding here is not just corn, but it's life. And so I want to start off with this. So I'll pass this around, and you guys take at least 5 or 10 kernels from there. And then I did have you. And so, the title of my presentation is Indigenous Agricultural Knowledge, Barriers, Policy, and Integration and Outreach. And so a little bit about myself. I used to work for the Natural Resource Conservation Service. The Natural Resource Conservation Service is a federal agency that deals specifically with a lot of conservation issues. They have a different amount of programs, but they're basically what a lot of people rely upon to help do things like bring conservation to the forefront, like as far as rangeland management, agricultural management. They're just a lead agency that they do that. So I was a district conservationist for 3 years out there on the Hopi Indian Reservation, and I found a lot of problems being out there. You know, don't that beat all? I found a lot of problems. But most importantly, I think besides all this and besides the degree that I'll hope to receive pretty soon, is the fact that I'm a Hopi dry farmer. I'm a traditional dry farmer. I've practiced this since I've been about 8 years old. My dad used to drop me off on the reservation because he was in the military, and I learned how to do all these fantastic techniques, and this is my type of knowledge being passed on to you so that someday this will continue on, and you'll see that. So boom, we're going to start off by first talking about some of the background and a little bit of context which I gave, but this is the roadmap that we're going to follow, and this particular map right here is called Hopi Prophecy Rock. This is our roadmap. This is our roadmap to survivability, to sustainability, and you can see what goes on, and I'll briefly describe this, is that this is the world that we currently live in, and you'll see a bunch of people going this way up this path right here, and you can see where it ends. And what this is telling us on a real short brief is that a lot of us are going to move away from our traditional values and our traditional system. And you'll see down here, there's the old gentleman with his planting stick and his plant and his plants through here, and his line continues to go on. And so what this is telling us down here is that if we believe in our traditional practice and we pass it on to the next generation, we'll be able to continue on into the next world. It's very important. But what makes this path unique is because of all this stuff that's going on up here with the people in the world in general, we still have a chance to go back and go on this path. We still have a chance to go back on this path. And this is what I'm trying to do, and this is what I will do when I get done here at the University of Arizona. So saying that, the goal of this dissertation is to identify barriers to American Indian participation in NRCS cost share programs and recommend policy changes to increase their participation. Now, an NRCS cost share program is basically the federal government pays some of it, and the person who's buying into it pays the other part of it. That's basically what a cost share program is. It's also called paid for ecosystem services type programs also. So we have 2 different types of cost share programs that are going on that I studied in my study. First of all, there's the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and there's also the Conservation Stewardship Program. And so basically what they do is they both require upfront capital. They both address farmers and ranchers and their natural resource concerns by providing technical and financial assistance. And they also require, this is the key one, they also require written permission from the landowner or owners. So what's really the difference between these two? Well, first of all, EQIP does not fund existing practices. And what I mean by existing practices is that, for example, at Hopi, we have a different types of conservation practices, and we put them in, and if they're already there, EQIP doesn't fund that. Now, Conservation Security Program, what that basically does, it maintains existing conservation practices that were maybe drawn out of EQIP. It also funds additional practices for conservation improvement. So if you have a practice that's on the ground and you need it to improve, it'll help do that. And also the contract length for CSP is 5 years compared to 10 years for EQIP. So you guys kind of understand that a little bit? So The NRCS Field Office Technical Guide is the primary guide where all these beautiful conservation that the United States came up, all these beautiful conservation practices. There's 219 of them. The thing about every practice that's contained in there, it's been scientifically tested and it's been validated. You know, NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, only funds practices that are in the FOTOC. And that's going to be a problem, but I'll be able to resolve that for you. So right now, you know, the value of this program together out of this recent farm bill for a 10-year period is around $34 billion. So there's a lot of conservation money out there. A lot of us should take advantage of that, right? But boom, what happens? So in 2017, what I found out that there was 1,035 contracts out of 440 contracts given in total just awarded to American Indian farming operators, and that's only 2%. 2%. So right there, you can already see there's a problem coming up, right? And still, there's this potential for them to apply their conservation practices and to help with our conservation practices on the 99 millions of acres of American Indian lands, what they call Indian country. Indian country. That's when my dad went to Vietnam, they said, "Oh, you're going in country." He didn't really know what that was until he got there and explained it. And not a happy place to be. But for me, it is. So, I've asked my question this, you know, when I was a district conservationist, and when I was out there, I noticed that when I left there in 2005, originally we had 14 projects, 14 NRCS projects from EQIP. And out of those 14, they were divided 69 different ways. So, for example, you would have 11 people under one contract, and they went wayward. In 2004, all these contracts were canceled except for one. And it happened to be the one that I was working on. So that says something right there, right? And it says, currently, right now, there is no Hopi NRCS district conservationist. So when I was up there even 3 years ago, that person got removed and there was nobody there. Excuse me. So a little bit of background about the Hopi Indian Reservation. We're up here in this place. We're surrounded by another reservation, which presents a little bit of problems. They have these multi-layered land tenure regimes, and I'll explain that. We have a population of only 78,000 that live on the reservation. A lot of them live off the reservation because of the economic factors that are out there. There's really just no jobs. Right now, I think it's about 50%. Once the Navajo generating station shuts down, we're going to lose 85% of our tribal budget. So that will go up higher, okay? We have a 66 unemployment rate, which will probably go to 80, and we have a median household income of only $15,875. And that is going to be a big devastation for us to lose that, but I feel that it's necessary because it has been, for a number of years, basically been polluting the Grand Canyon and everything else. So back to the roadmap. So when I was there and I saw that we didn't have that many contracts, I began to ask myself, well, what kind of barriers was I finding? What kind of barriers was I finding? Man, first of all, my initial finding says that many studies have examined conservation incentive programs in less developed countries, but only three studies were conducted in the United States. But yet, this is where these programs come from. Why is that? You know, I had three. Mine was the third one, right? And recently it got published last June. It got published in the Ecosystem Services, the lead journal for these type of programs. You know, indigenous communities, and what I really found out, and I said indigenous communities in developed countries face similar barriers as indigenous people in less developed countries. So why is that? I ask myself, why? Because we're a land that has a lot of opportunities. Why in the world do we have the same barriers that other indigenous people face? You know? My immediate thought was, well, indigenous people are just kind of messed up everywhere they go, you know? So I kind of looked at that, and what did I find out? Well, back in my early days, Johnson versus McIntosh. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but this is why the main reason why we're having all these barriers is that Indians have the right to occupancy, but they do not have the title to their own land. People don't know that, but we don't. We're trustees of the federal government. And what is this whole ruling based upon, this big ruling? It's based upon the doctrine of discovery. That means that you were discovered, that's our land now, you can live there, but we still own it. And if you notice the connection here, this doctrine of discovery was plastered everywhere all over the globe. So that's why our barriers are very similar to those people who live down in Latin America and those people who live in the United States, live in Australia. We have those same type of barriers. So when I wanted to evaluate that, what were my objectives of this? First, on this first paper, I wanted to identify the barriers that prevented our Hopi ranchers and farmers from participating in NRCS cost share programs. And the second thing I wanted to do was I wanted to determine what institutional changes are necessary to successful participation in NRCS cost share programs. What are we going to have to do? So the methods that I used were simple, sort of simple. I used document reviews. I looked at a number of documents. I used key uniform interviews. I went up and interviewed all these stakeholders. Now the amount may seem small, but it's not, because the program is not that big and there's not that many officials in the tribe. And I used this inductive coding method. So what I did was I took the documents and the interviews and I looked for common themes. And that determined my barriers. So what common themes did I find? Boom, multi-layered 10 regimes. That was the biggest barrier to our program. The lack of capital, the lack of communication, and institutional design flaws. That's what I found in that paper. So some of the results, this is a little bit of a display for those of you who are kind of into statistics. This kind of makes that a little bit more clear. So what I did was I put together this table right here, and you can see that, for example, I looked at 6 annual reviews, and what happened, and then I put them all together, all the common themes under here, and it came out to, it was mentioned 16 times out of 27. And so that's how I determined my common themes, and that was the 4 major ones. And so we're going to talk about barrier 1, multi-layered land tenure and land tenure insecurity. First of all, there's this tremendous amount of jurisdictional issues out there because we don't know really who owns the land. We have a lot of different land tenure setups that cause that problem. The other thing is that because we don't know who owns the land, we have a lot of issues with written permission. Now, written permission, like I said earlier, is required by NRCS in order to move a contract forward and has to be signed by everybody as the contract progresses. If it needs amendments, it has to be signed by them also, and therefore it requires multiple signature issues. More than one people on one contract. So like I said, you have 14 projects, 69 contracts. One contract had 11 individual contract holders divided that many ways, and each person had a sign on that. So when I'm talking about this, so this is the kind of land tenure that I'm talking about. We have tribal trust land, allotted land, fee land, land that is held by the individual and not in trust, clan land and village land. These are Hopi Pacific, because within these big bodies of land, we have these type of lands, and the jurisdiction falls under the clan or it falls under the village. If anybody doesn't know what a clan is like an extended family. They're not basically biologically related to you, but they came from the same place. They came on these different migration paths. And this is what I'm going to talk about. So we have, for example, down here in let's say Blue Point. This is land that's held in common, and what happens, you have, when the NRCS project was out there, we had one project putting in a windmill, and that project was divided 11 different ways because it's held in common. Now it falls under the jurisdiction out here of basically the clan because it's out in this area, and these ones will fall under the jurisdiction of the tribe only. The whole thing falls under the jurisdiction of the United States because, well, like I said, we have the right to occupancy but not the right to title. So when I talk about this is an example of the contract, one of my documents that I use. This is called Multiple Irrigation Project. This was done on allotted land, which is basically that under the Allotment Act, they gave each individual Indian about 150 acres, and they were expected to live on that. But because we don't write things, we had a big probate issue where sometimes now you have 168 people owning about 150 acres of land. So you need 168 signatures to move that forward. It's unfortunate, right? And so, but you can see how it's divided out. You have one contract and you have all this divided out equally. Doesn't make sense, huh? But we're going to get good. Don't look so sad because we're going on. There's going to be some good shots at the end. It's just, I have to lay the barriers out there because we got to understand the problem first, and then we're able to help solve it. So the next barrier, lack of monetary funds, like I just said, a lot of tribes do not have the money to actually initiate these conservation programs, even if they are cost share, because a lot of their money is being pumped into their health system, their education system, their tribal government, and so forth. the burden of taxes. A lot of times, even the participants, when they were going to receive, especially the older ones, when they were going to receive a paycheck from the federal government for their cost share amount being reimbursed to them, they were worried about that because they didn't know they had to pay taxes on it. And that was hurting their Social Security payments. And this whole idea of the top-down view of capital, the United States government has big pockets. And so they're always looking at things from the top. They think, well, if you sign it, you can pay for it and everything's going to be okay. But that's not true. So it's this top-down look of how we initiate this program. Lack of communication. This is not really talked about, but I'm mentioning it here because it is a barrier, because it goes throughout my whole entire thing. Participants do not understand the contract. When I was doing annual reviews, which is a process of having the contract holder come in and talking about his contract, he did not even understand the language in the contract. He just signed on the dotted line, thinking it was going to be a good thing. That sound familiar? And so, and as a result of that, you have all these untimely project delays, and it really slowed down. That's why the projects got canceled. For example, what happens is when you go out and sign a contract, NRCS contract, you're locked into the price of what that material is. For example, back in 2001, 1 foot of barbed wire was $1 a foot, and the contract wasn't started till 4 years later, and then it was $2.50 a foot. And so therefore, that person, without an amendment, would only get 1/4 of his fence because it wasn't started right away. That's what happens when you have untimely project delays. And then you have this total mistrust. The end result, you have this total mistrust between the contract holder, the tribe, and the federal government. They just don't like each other because they don't talk to each other. Okay? So when I found out these institutional design flaws, that's a pretty big word, there's really this lack of interagency cooperation. Now, you got to understand that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they're basically the primary trustees of our lands out there, and they need certain permission. The NRCS needs certain permission in order to get things moving out there, and so they always have to have these mutual agreements of understanding all the time. You know, there's a lack of oversight. For example, when I got there, I opened the contract folder expecting a conservation plan. That's the number one thing you do as a district conservationist. Make sure that's done before you even sign a contract. Written permission from the landowner. All I found in the contract folder was just the contract. And the government signed off on it. You know? Before I left there, you know, this is kind of a side, but before I left there, I filed this big old massive report saying to the Office of Inspector General at USDA, I get a letter back saying that there's really no problem, they're allowed to do that, you know? And so that kind of got me going. Maybe I need to go back to college. You know? And so it's like that. They're just passing the burden. That was the last thing, just passing the burden along to each other. You know, so why did EQIP fail in Hopi? Well, the biggest reason, like I said earlier again, was this lack of land tenure insecurity. Nobody knew what was going on. Nobody knew who was owning the land. It was causing a problem. And all these culturally inappropriate institutional mismatches. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about just different ways of knowing. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about this indigenous agricultural knowledge, the same knowledge that this gentleman is using right here to survive and go on to the next generation. So what is indigenous agricultural knowledge? This is my second paper, by the way. Basically, we came up with a new term. It's been coined once or twice, but what we're saying here is that it's applied knowledge for raising food and other agricultural products that is grounded in indigenous belief systems and practices which have been time-tested over millennia. I removed the word "a" out of there because I'm not just talking just 1,000 years, I'm talking millennia. So I'm talking the plural form of that over 2,000, 10,000 years. That make sense? So, one of my main hypotheses is that indigenous ways of knowing and NRCS institutional management structures are impeding federal conservation efforts on Hopi and other indigenous territories. I was thinking, okay, we have these tensions that exist, so what can we do about it? Well, we got to understand it a little bit, first of all. We got to see where it's coming from. And I looked at the systems and I stacked them up. This is the NRCS system for windbreaks. This is the Hopi system for windbreaks. Besides all the materials using, we're here doing this so that we can survive. They're over here trying to raise cattle and commodities. It makes no sense, but that's what it's about, right? So you have this capitalistic driving system and you have this indigenous value system that they're conflict, but they're not really conflict because in order for them to survive, they need to do this. Right? Make sense? So when I look at this, I kind of wanted to show the similarities in a little different way, because there's always comparing Western science and indigenous ways of knowing. So I kind of want to show this, and I'm not going to say which one is better and which one is worse. That's up to you to decide. But when we talk about rigor, we're looking at this scientific method and short-term experiences. That's how they judge rigor. We've done it by time-testedness over millennia. We look at our societal norms, our indigenous value system, our capital systems. And one more that I want to point out here, panel of experts, peer review. For you who have ever experienced a peer review process, that took me a year to get that first paper published, because my panel of experts, which were other colleagues, took that long to do it. Now, if these were Hopis out here, wouldn't happen. I'll be planting corn next month. So that's what I mean by panel of experts. And look at this replicability. Replicability, 2,000 years of replicability for one technique, I guarantee that, versus only 200 or less than what the NRCS has. And knowledge, so what's the purpose of all this? Well, first of all, I wanted to demonstrate that case-based methods have similar conservation outcomes as NRCS standard practices. That's why I did this paper. I needed some evidence. And I didn't really need to prove it scientifically, because it's been replicated so many times, right? So what are the methods that I used? I basically looked at 3 tribes here, the Hopi tribe, the Lakota, Orilla Banda, Chippewa, and the Menominee tribe. And I looked at, because I was doing agriculture and NRCS supports all these, I looked at the farming methods of the Hopi. I looked at the wildlife rice harvesting, and that has to do with wetlands. And I looked at the forestry practices of these tribes. And I did a literature review, and I also compared and contrasted these methods. And so what did I find? I found that IAK methods and NRCS standard practices, they do produce the same similar outcomes, but they're just approached differently. So when am I talking about approach? I've got a couple examples. So you have this holistic practice of flat bottom boats. Rice is not harvested to fully mature. Wild rice plants are left intact after harvesting. Now this is one process. You come over here, and if you look up these definitions, wetland enhancement, wild wetland high habitat management, wetland restoration, and you compare the outcomes, they're the same. But this is in the English language, because I don't know how to speak Ojibwe. But the outcomes are the same: provide suitable habitat for desired fish and other aquatic species. So when they're over here, harvesting, they make these canals, and that loosens things up, and the fish are able to move in. When the rice falls off the plants, they're able to feed off of that. So it's a continuous way, It's not just linear like this. So that's one of the things. Now we're going to talk about what I do, because this is what I'm proud of. So we use this is how we implement some of our dryland practices, like, plant rows are placed perpendicular. That's the same as contour farming. It helps reduce all the soil and wind erosion. Corn stalks are left in the field, helps with nutrient management. Natural runoff from monsoon streams channeled into the field. All things like field borders there. It's kind of, when I was doing this, because I'm so involved in the human capacity living with nature, I spelled field borders B-O-A-R-D-E-S. So one of my persons was, well, you live there? And I said, yeah, I do, but maybe I spelled it wrong, like they said. So I was already trying to get in my Hopi mindset, right? And so anyway, so that's how that works. But let me show you what I'm talking about visually. So this is contour farming. This is what it looks like. This is keeping soil erosion from happening by planting it perpendicular. We've been doing the same thing. But unfortunately, these are scientifically validated. These practices are not, so we don't get funded for that. Makes no sense, right? And I ask myself, well, who came up with the method first? 2,000 versus 75 years, I wonder about that. There's a great guy out there named Leopold, and he says that he's the father of conservation, or someone coined him that. And I said, well, that's your opinion. I'm not very argumentative. I don't like to be argumentative, right? And so the same thing with crosswind trap strips. The same thing. We've been doing this forever. We're smart enough not to clear our field and have another dust bowl, so we'll leave stuff in there. and then we don't, and then the soil stays where it's supposed to. You know, they have to do this because they've got about a 4,000 acre field. Now I'm kind of comparing apples and oranges a little bit in the fact that the scales are much bigger, but you got to understand that this is for survival and this is for economics. Looking at field borders again. See, we just leave that stuff naturally in there. What NRCS has to come in there, they have to put in all this stuff, and sometimes it's not even native species. So you get things like buffalo grass. You get things like back in the days they were planting Russian olives out there. You know? No type of planting. They just put it out there. You know? So then you got nutrient management. This is a beautiful shot. I like this shot because this is our nutrient management. After one big monsoon storm, we bring in all this new sediment because of the location of our fields. All these new things that help crops grow. But what do we do here in America? We have to have one of these big expensive machines just drop manure all over the ground. You know? I got one outhouse. You know how long that take me? So it's kind of like that. It's the nutrient aspect of it, right? Well, I'm having fun today, you know? And so when I kind of tie all this thing together, you kind of look at both the methods, and this is kind of what it is. Indigenous agricultural knowledge is basically an offshoot of traditional ecological knowledge. Basically is that. But they're all place-based. So they work good in our location. And because they're place-based, I try to figure out, well, what would allow them to remain place-based, and how could we help us, indigenous society or American Indian populations participate more in these CASHIR programs. So what did I come up with? Policy recommendations. Policy recommendations that offer a solution, thus the hence recommendations. So I wanted to tackle these. I wanted to tackle the four. I left out lack of communication because you'll need that through all this whole process. But I first start off by talking about offering a policy solution to land tenure insecurity, which is the multi-layered situation, lack of capital, and limited recognition of time-tested indigenous agricultural techniques, a lot of words for institutional mismatches. So how do I talk about that? First of all, I wanted to take advantage of what's already out there. I wanted to use Public Law 93-638, written in 1975, under the self-determination era, where the tribes are actually allowed to start running some of the programs themselves to get away from the paternalistic influence of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so the Act authorizes federal agencies to enter into contracts and make grants directly to federally recognized Indian tribal governments. So I wanted to use that. So how am I going to implement that? And what can it do? First of all, it could be used to allow for more tribal control functions currently under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has a part of their stuff has direct control over agriculture and rangeland improvements, but so does NCS. So I wanted to remove those from them through a simple letter and have their tribe take over this part of that Bureau BIA function. Okay, so what that's going to do, that's going to streamline the administrative approval for an implementation process because it's burdensome. You know, and so we're doing that. And NRCS conservation plans, now this is the kicker. We can go out and get a conservation plan. We can go out and sign a contract with the mineral company, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs has to approve that. That's what happens when you're under trust status of the United States government. So some of the solutions to the lack of capital. Well, first of all, the NRCS state conservation is for these cost-share contracts, you know, which what I explained earlier, which is a contract where the participant pays some and the government pays some. Right now, because we're what they call an undeserved population or a socially disadvantaged population or whatever else the government wants to talk to us about. To me, we're just Indians, but you know they want to call us all these other names. Right now, the district conservationist has the flexibility to improve our cost share rate from 75 to 90%. So that means that we'll only be responsible for 90% of that contract, and it'll be reimbursed by that. Now, there's a little bit of confusion here. If you look at the advance payment, what I'm recommending is that under the new 2018 Farm Bill and the prior one, we're only allowed to receive 50%. Now, the advance payment is different from the cost share rate because the advance payment basically provides money right up front to buy materials, which we don't have. That's really the difference right there. And so what we're advocating here is we're trying to have the same flexibility as this, and you'll see how I'm going to spread it around once I get done with this dissertation here. Right? So solutions to limited recognitions. First of all, I looked at the NRCS photog and I said, based upon our own knowledge, and it's going to be just like the field office technical guide, only it's going to be our own and we'll be able to use it. It'll have the same power as the NRCS field office technical guide. And we're going to do it multiple. We're going to have multiple, and we're going to do it because of the diversity of climatic conditions across the country. So it's going to be place-based. It's going to be able to deal with that because the things that are growing in different parts of the country along with the people, they know how to adapt. Does that make sense? So what are the objectives? First of all, we're to demonstrate that indigenous agricultural practices are legitimized by their rigor, replicability, and conservation outcomes. Everything in those iPhotogs will have that. We're going to treat IAK methods. It treats IAK methods as NRCS standard practices for attaining NRCS contracts and funding. So that's another mechanism that it's going to do, like I just mentioned. It's going to circumvent the current procedure of adding IAK methods to the NRCS photog, which I said is not really streamlined, and it's just hard to do that. It's really hard to do that because a lot of times you have to talk about everything, and it kind of gives up away some of your intellectual property rights. And the other thing is, like I said, streamline the administrative process for USDA to enter into alternative funding arrangements with tribes. Because we'll have our photog, we'll be able to draw from that, come up with our own conservation plan, and we'll be able to use that alternative funding as a mechanism to get it done. Does that make sense? So how's it going to be implemented? Well, first of all, the knowledge holders will have this up here. The producers and the elders will meet that are American Indian. We'll talk about it. And we'll figure out what do we want to show people. A lot of our knowledge has already been drafted and assumed a different type of name. No-till agriculture. We've been doing that forever. There's a new one called regenerative agriculture. We've been doing that forever. God, I think coming here, I really learned how. I took my Hopi language and learned how to make it scientific. But anyways, but when we get to this process, when we get to know what we're in, then we're going to bring in NRCS because they have to be involved in the process because this is the thing that they're going to support. So when we determine what we want in there, we're going to talk to NRCS, we're going to set it up, and then we're going to translate it into this beautiful iPhotog that's going to be distributed regionally. And tribes will be able to draw on this, they'll be able to use this, and they'll be able to implement a lot of what they do. And a lot of this, because these are environmentally beneficially and cost effective, a lot of this money will be used for labor, to create incentives for people to come out and work. And I'll give you an example, because when I was a kid, we had maybe 10 people out of my relatives come out there and plant a field in. Now I have to use a tractor. We can do it in an hour, but by myself, it would take me 3 days. So I need to get more people to do it, and I'll talk about that. So back to outreach. So now that we have all of this stuff out of the way, how can I gain public support? How can I make sure that this man is still going? Whoops, sorry about that. Wait, wrong way. So how can I make sure that this man is still continuing on to the next generation? So I come up with an outreach component that I actually did last year. And this outreach component is a museum exhibit. Sarah got the Arizona State Museum. I don't know if you've ever been over there. Beautiful place. And I think a lot of it, one of the main reasons I did that was I wanted to bring recognition back to Indian people. I got tired of going over there and looking at artifacts all over the place. So I wanted to re-indigenize the Arizona State Museum. Yeah, exactly. And so in that, I show a few things. I show the resiliency and continuity of our Hopi agricultural system. Like I said, it's going to be a public outreach. I've got requests this May to talk to the Smithsonian on an article, and they're going to come out, and they're already in the works of actually getting this thing transferred by paying for it to go over there. And that's different. I'm in sciences, right? But yet I'm able to go beyond that and help people. Because without helping people, I wouldn't be here. And it also allows me to share indigenous knowledge in a cultural appropriate manner. We've got to do that, folks. We can't just assume everything. So when I talk about resiliency, I kind of wanted to talk about, these are going to be some of my slides that I'm talking about. And when we're talking about how long have we been doing this, this Well, this right here, this quote was taken, the land is very fertile for maize and cotton, everything sown in it, because it is a temperate land with little toil. The natives cultivate the sandy places that greatly conserve the moisture from the snows. Notice the word conserve, conservation. When was this written? 1583. If I had a camera, I guarantee those fields would look like they're due today, you know? So these are kind of our pictures of what we do when I'm talking about the resiliency. I mean, look at these, look at the biodiversity of these crops. You don't have this here in America. Very few tribes have this. In fact, Hopi, I think, would be the last bastion of true crop biodiversity in the United States, which needs to be protected. But it needs to be protected from a cultural standpoint of view, and so we need to look at it from that way. We don't want to go out there like Monsanto, come, oh, you got these drought resistant, we want to take this and that, you know. Also, look at this one. The beliefs and practices that define us as indigenous people are often called informal knowledge. I must ask what makes the so-called formal knowledge of scientists and academics more valuable. Ask yourself that. What am I talking about today? All I'm doing is combining both Western and ways. But look at the pictures right here. 1901, 2015. Look at the continuity. Look at that. You know, it hasn't changed. You don't see a $100,000 John Deere 14-row planter out there. You see a little Hopies out there with their John Deere hats and a planting stick. That's all you need, right? So that's just beautiful, you know. And so these are in the exhibit. When I want to talk about fitting the environment, you know, when I talk about place-based, Hopi is the only place I know where corn is planted to fit the environment. The environment is not manipulated to fit the corn. Does that make sense? In here in the United States, we're constantly trying to change things. You know, how many people can grow corn in the Midwest when I only get 6 to 10 inches of annual rainfall a year? Nobody. When I was at Cornell University, they said, the agronomist said, oh, you can't do that. And we set up an experiment in the warehouse, and then we put down 50 barrels and we put our corn down that deep. They put their Boone County white, which was the time what a lot of people were eating. They put theirs down 1 inch. We let it go 2 weeks. Popped up at the same time, from 2 feet depth to 1 inch depth. Popped up at the same time. You know, and what was the next question they asked me? Where do we get those seeds? But it insulted me because I've already explained, I'm trying to prove something that they believe me. Oh, wow, you know, where do you get those seeds? And so I said, well, I'm taking those with me. So I took them with me. And that's why I always carry seeds in my pocket, right? And so that's the beauty of it. But when I'm talking about place-based knowledge, for example, this is a good shot right here. Last year I didn't see any of this. This is called rabbit brush. I didn't see any of this in my field, and I knew I had a drought. And I wasn't going to raise anything. But because of the tremendous amount of faith we have, and that's one thing that I'm going to talk about more, what keeps our agricultural system so resilient is that it's directly tied to our ceremonialism and our belief system. You can't separate them. You know? Maize is not that pretty little Indian lady on the thing of butter, you know? She's not that. You know? She's more important than that, right? And so the Hopi ingenuity, when I'm talking about, you know, back they had the moldboard plow came out, they gave us that when the NRCS or whoever, they gave us that instrument, and it just tears up the soil, rips it up. That's what caused the Dust Bowl, a lot of these moldboard plow things, you know. And so what happens, what we did was we used this thing. We said we like the concept of cutting the weeds and stuff, but we have a straight blade cultivator right here. And that just takes off 2 things of the soil, 2 inches of the soil. And you got to understand, to raise crops in a dry environment, all of our techniques revolve around conserving soil moisture. They have to. I can't transfer this system down here to Marana, but I can take some of my philosophies down there and I'll talk to them about it. Maybe widen your rows out, help you save some water. You know, if you let people know what you're doing conservationally, maybe they'll buy your product more. You know? What are the benefits of this? So what am I trying to do? What are all the benefits? Well, you know, up down here in a lot of reservations, obesity runs over 50, 60%. Down at TO, they have an 88, 85% diabetic rate. You know, so how am I going to implement this? By having more people involved in this, by talking about this. Under the new Farm Bill, we're able to take more advantage of food programs, and that's to introduce our own traditional foods thoroughly throughout where we're going in the United States. So this has a lot of benefits that just the NRCS standard practice does not. These traditional practices. We should hold on to that. So what does my future research want to do? First of all, I want to continue to address the issues associated with the barriers in indigenous communities. Mostly agriculture related, but a lot of other things. I want to aid in the development of beneficial and cost-effective solutions to address environmental problems. I want to assist in reinforcing tribal ways of knowing to increase human well-being, what they call in situ or place-based conservation. That means keep it at the same location. And I want to bridge the communication gap between science and indigenous communities. So if you know a job that does that, let me know. So the conclusion of this, and I'm going to wrap this up now, is to meet the pressing environmental challenges we face as a broader society, we must create new environmental solutions through the integration of Western-based science, because indigenous agricultural knowledge has its very foundations that are grounded in survival. You know that corn that I gave you guys all got some of that, right? So, my way I want to thank you, but if you really to look at your corn that you're growing right there, this is not just about science, this is about survival. This is the beauty of this. And unlike science, this has a 100% success rate. So I guarantee if you plant this corn, it's going to come up. So this is what my whole presentation is really about. It's about our survival. It's about survival. It's about moving on into the next generation so little kids can hold corn like this 100 years from now. With that, I want to thank you.